Trump's ultimatum: negotiate or we walk away. If Donald Trump is re-elected and follows through on his ultimatum to Ukraine, either you negotiate, or we leave. This could mark a major turning point in the war. Trump has repeatedly stated that he believes the war should end through negotiations rather than continued military aid. This stance contrasts sharply with the Biden administration's unwavering commitment to arming Ukraine. Key questions. 1. What does this mean for U.S. support? Will the U.S. completely withdraw military aid, or just reduce it? Will Trump's threat be absolute, or is it a negotiation tactic? Could Congress override Trump's decision and continue aid? 2. Will Ukraine be forced into a peace deal? How much leverage does Trump have over Zelensky? Will Ukraine still be able to fight effectively without U.S. support? What kind of deal would Russia demand, and would Ukraine accept it? What does this mean for U.S. support? Scenario 1. Trump completely cuts U.S. aid to Ukraine. Most extreme case, very disruptive. If Trump fully withdraws U.S. support, Ukraine would lose access to billions of dollars in weapons, intelligence, and financial aid. Ukraine's ability to sustain its military efforts would be severely weakened. Russia would likely see this as an opportunity to launch a new offensive and push for more territorial gains. Europe would try to step in, but it may struggle to match the scale of U.S. support. Outcome prediction: if aid is completely cut, Ukraine would likely struggle to defend its current positions. Over time, Ukraine could be forced to accept a ceasefire or a deal that leaves parts of its territory under Russian control. The war could shift toward a frozen conflict, similar to North and South Korea. Scenario 2. Trump reduces aid but doesn't fully withdraw. More likely middle ground outcome: Trump might significantly cut aid but still provide some level of support to maintain leverage. He could demand that Ukraine enter negotiations while keeping limited military assistance flowing. This would weaken Ukraine's military position but not destroy it completely. The war could shift into a prolonged stalemate, with neither side making major gains. Outcome prediction: Ukraine might still resist a full peace deal but could be forced to accept a ceasefire. Russia could use this as an opportunity to consolidate its gains and rearm for a future offensive. European allies might try to fill the gap, but they may not be able to fully replace US aid. Scenario 3. Trump uses the threat as a negotiation tactic but maintains some support. Possible diplomatic strategy: Trump's ultimatum could be more of a bargaining tool than an absolute decision. He could use the threat of cutting aid to force Ukraine into indirect or preliminary negotiations. US aid might continue at a reduced level, allowing Ukraine to maintain a defensive posture but limiting its ability to launch counteroffensives. Outcome prediction: this scenario could lead to a prolonged war with occasional diplomatic efforts. It could also lead to a soft peace, where neither side officially surrenders, but active fighting decreases. The situation could remain unstable, with the possibility of future escalations. Will Ukraine be forced into a peace deal? Scenario 1. Ukraine is forced into a Russian-favorable peace deal. Worst-case scenario for Ukraine: if the US completely withdraws aid and European support isn't enough, Ukraine may have no choice but to negotiate from a position of weakness. Russia would likely demand recognition of its territorial gains in Crimea, Donbas, and other occupied regions. Ukraine would likely resist such a deal, but without sufficient weapons, it could be left with no viable military alternative. Outcome prediction: Ukraine might be forced to accept a ceasefire that de facto recognizes Russian control over occupied areas. This could weaken Zelensky's political standing and cause internal unrest within Ukraine. Russia would claim victory, potentially emboldening Putin to take more aggressive actions in the future. Scenario 2. Ukraine refuses to negotiate, fights without US support, a risky gamble for Ukraine. If Ukraine refuses to enter negotiations despite Trump's pressure, it would need to rely on European allies. While Europe could increase aid, it might not be able to match US support in terms of weapons, intelligence, and financial backing. This could lead to a prolonged, grinding war where Ukraine struggles to maintain its defenses. Outcome prediction: Ukraine could still fight but might lose ground due to reduced resources. Over time, war fatigue could set in, making negotiations more likely but from a weaker position. If European support isn't enough, Ukraine might eventually have to accept a settlement on worse terms. Scenario 3. Ukraine engages in limited negotiations but avoids full surrender. Most likely diplomatic outcome: under pressure, Ukraine might engage in limited or indirect negotiations with Russia. This could lead to a ceasefire or temporary agreements on humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, or demilitarized zones. However, Ukraine is unlikely to formally surrender or recognize Russian territorial claims. Outcome prediction: A fragile ceasefire could emerge, but long-term peace would remain uncertain. Ukraine might continue military resistance in smaller ways while using diplomacy to gain security guarantees from NATO and the EU. The war could become a frozen conflict, with no clear winner but reduced active fighting. Final predictions: the most likely chain of events short-term, first 6-12 months of a Trump presidency. 1. Trump pressures Ukraine to negotiate by threatening to cut off US aid. 2. Ukraine resists full-scale negotiations but may engage in limited diplomatic talks. 3. US military aid is reduced but not entirely eliminated. 4. Russia may test the situation by increasing attacks to pressure Ukraine further. 5. European allies try to fill the gap, but their capacity is limited. Medium term, 1-2 years. 1. If US aid is significantly reduced, Ukraine's military position weakens. 2. Russia may consolidate its territorial gains and push for a settlement favorable to its interests. 3. A ceasefire or frozen conflict emerges, with neither side fully satisfied. 4. Political instability in Ukraine may increase if public opinion shifts due to war fatigue. Long term, beyond 2 years. 1. If a ceasefire is reached, Ukraine may push for NATO or EU security guarantees. 2. Russia may use the ceasefire period to regroup and prepare for future offensives. 3. Trump's policies could shape the broader geopolitical landscape, influencing NATO's role in US-Russia relations. Conclusion: a high-stakes gamble for Ukraine and the West. Trump's ultimatum, negotiate or we leave, puts Ukraine in a difficult position. The most likely outcome is not an immediate surrender but a shift toward diplomacy under pressure. However, if the US fully cuts off aid, Ukraine's military situation could deteriorate, forcing it into negotiations from a weaker position. Ultimately, the war's outcome will depend on how much leverage Trump actually applies, how Europe responds, and how resilient Ukraine remains without full US backing. The worst-case scenario is a forced settlement favoring Russia, while the best-case scenario is a negotiated ceasefire that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty without major